There is a moment, somewhere in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday, when a teacher stands at the front of a room full of young faces and feels, quietly, that something is not working. Not the lesson, not the students, something deeper, something about the whole way they have been taught to think about teaching itself. And it is in that moment, that strange, hollow, uncertain moment, that a book written over 100 years ago becomes more relevant than almost anything published this week. William James, one of the greatest minds America ever produced, sat down in the late 1800s and gave a series of lectures to teachers, not to philosophers, not to academics locked away in universities with leather chairs and pipe smoke. He spoke to teachers, the people in the room every single day with children, the people carrying the enormous invisible weight of shaping how a generation learns to think. And what he told them was not what they expected. It was not a method. It was not a system. It was not a checklist. It was something far more lasting. It was a way of seeing, a way of understanding the human being sitting in front of you, and a way of understanding yourself as the person trying to reach them. This is the summary of that book, Talks to Teachers on Psychology by William James. But more than a summary, this is an exploration of ideas that change the field of education permanently, ideas that most teachers today have never formally studied but have instinctively felt, ideas that will make you look at learning, at children, at habit, at attention, at motivation, in a completely different way. So settle in, because what comes next is not a quick list of takeaways. This is a journey through one of the most beautifully written, most human, most honest books about teaching ever put into words. William James was not a teacher in the traditional sense. He was a philosopher and a psychologist, one of the founders of a school of thought called pragmatism, which believed that ideas are only valuable if they actually work in real life. He was also a Harvard professor, a deeply curious man, someone who had struggled with his own mental health and emerged from that struggle with a profound tenderness for human beings and their inner lives. When he agreed to give these lectures to teachers in Cambridge, Massachusetts, he was not approaching them as someone looking down from a great academic height. He was approaching them as someone who genuinely believed that teachers, real classroom teachers, deserved to understand the science of the mind just as much as anyone else. And here is where the book begins with something that might surprise you. James opens by telling teachers something almost nobody else was willing to say out loud. He tells them that psychology, the scientific study of the mind, cannot by itself tell you how to teach. That sentence alone could fill a room with uncomfortable silence. Here is this famous psychologist, invited to explain psychology to teachers, and within the first few pages, he is already telling them that psychology has limits. He says that teaching is an art, and like all arts, it requires something beyond theory. It requires judgment. It requires sensitivity. It requires what he calls the tact of the teacher. What does that mean exactly? It means that knowing how the brain works does not automatically tell you what to do with any specific child in any specific moment. A doctor can know all the biology of the human heart and still need years of clinical experience before they know how to truly help a patient. A musician can study music theory exhaustively and still need to feel the music before they can move an audience. Teaching is the same. You can study psychology deeply, and James encourages teachers to do exactly that, but you still have to translate that knowledge through your own human judgment, through your own personality, through your own relationship with the child in front of you. That translation cannot be found in a textbook. It lives in the space between you and the student. This is not James being modest about psychology. He genuinely believes psychology is important and useful. But he is warning teachers against a trap that many educators fall into, the trap of thinking that if you just learn the right technique, if you just apply the correct method, teaching will become mechanical and reliable. It will not. Children are not machines, and neither are you. The moment you start treating the classroom like a factory with inputs and outputs, you lose the thing that makes teaching work at all, which is the living, breathing human connection between a teacher who cares and a student who feels that care. So James begins by asking teachers to hold two things at once. Study the science, yes. Understand psychology, yes. But never forget that you are also an artist working with human beings, and artists have to feel their way through, not just calculate their way through. From there, James moves into one of the most important ideas in the entire book, and it is one that is so simple that it is easy to underestimate. He talks about the child's stream of consciousness. Every child, every human being experiences life not as a series of separate, isolated moments, but as a continuous flow of thoughts, feelings, sensations, and reactions, all running together, all influencing each other, all moving without ever fully stopping. This stream is always there. It was there before the child walked into your classroom. It will be there long after your lesson ends. And everything you say and do as a teacher is entering that stream, not landing in an empty vessel. This changes everything about how you approach teaching. It means that a child who seems distracted is not broken or defiant. Their stream of consciousness has simply been pulled somewhere else, somewhere more urgent, somewhere more interesting, somewhere more emotionally charged. Maybe they had a fight with their parents that morning. Maybe they are hungry. Maybe something you said 10 minutes ago is still running circles in their mind and they have not been able to let it go. The stream does not stop just because you want it to. So what do you do with that knowledge? James says you work with the stream, not against it. You do not try to force a child's attention. You try to capture it. You try to connect what you are teaching to something already flowing in that stream, something the child already cares about, already wonders about, already has some feeling toward. Because attention is not a faucet that you can turn on by demanding it. Attention is drawn, it is attracted, it moves toward what is interesting, what is relevant, what is connected to something that already matters. Here, James introduces a distinction that teachers in the 19th century found fascinating, and that teachers today still find useful. He talks about two kinds of attention. The first is what he calls passive or involuntary attention. This is the kind that happens automatically, without effort, when something catches your eye or your ear because it is vivid, surprising, moving, beautiful, or connected to something you already care about. You do not choose to pay attention. Something simply grabs you. The second kind is what he calls active or voluntary attention. This is the kind that requires effort. This is the attention you summon when you are reading something difficult, when you are working through a problem, when you make yourself focus even though part of you would rather be doing something else. Now here is what James says that most people in his era were getting wrong, and that many people today are still getting wrong. The traditional model of education assumed that the goal of teaching was to develop and exercise voluntary attention in students, to train them to focus even when things are boring, to build the mental muscle of sustained, effortful concentration. And James does not say this is wrong exactly. He says it is incomplete, because voluntary attention is exhausting. It cannot be sustained for very long. It requires energy that runs out. And when you rely on it exclusively, you are essentially asking children to fight against their own nature all day long. The better approach, James argues, is to constantly find ways to revive passive attention, to bring it back into play, to make the subject matter itself interesting enough that the child's attention does not have to be forced, it is simply drawn. And this does not mean making everything a game or dumbing things down. It means finding the genuine interest that exists in almost every subject if you know how to reveal it. A history lesson that connects to the drama of real human decisions draws passive attention. A math problem that connects to something the child genuinely wants to figure out draws passive attention. A science experiment that produces something surprising and visible draws passive attention. You are not tricking the child. You are helping them discover that the subject is worth paying attention to. And then, once that passive interest is alive, voluntary attention can take over for the harder parts, the parts that require effort, the parts that are less immediately exciting, the parts where the child has to push through difficulty. But it is so much easier to sustain voluntary attention when it is working alongside genuine interest rather than trying to compensate for complete absence of it. James then moves into one of the most celebrated and enduring sections of the entire book, the section on habit. And this is where the writing becomes almost breathtaking in its clarity and its insight. Habit, James says, is the flywheel of society. It is the single greatest conserving force in human life. It is the thing that keeps us from having to redecide everything from scratch every single morning. Because of habit, you can tie your shoes without thinking about it, drive a familiar route without consulting your memory at every turn, perform dozens of daily actions without spending any conscious energy on them at all. That freed up energy can go toward the things that actually require thought. For a teacher, understanding habit is not optional, it is essential, because what you are doing in a classroom is not just transmitting information. You are helping to build habits, habits of thought, habits of curiosity, habits of effort, habits of attention. The habits that form in childhood tend to stick with extraordinary tenacity. Not because they are inevitable or fixed, but because the nervous system, especially the young nervous system, is remarkably plastic and receptive. It is shaped by repetition. What gets repeated becomes automatic. What becomes automatic becomes part of who the child is. James makes a point here that hits differently depending on where you are in your life. He says that by the time most people reach the age of 30, their character is essentially set. Their habits of mind, their emotional responses, their ways of engaging with challenges and pleasures, these have become grooved into the nervous system in ways that are very difficult to change later. He is not saying change is impossible after 30. He is saying that the window of maximum plasticity is in the early years, and that window, once it narrows, never fully reopens. This is why teachers matter so much. Not because they are the only influence on a child, not because a single classroom experience determines everything, but because they are present during the years when grooves are being cut, when patterns are being laid down, when a child is learning not just content but how to be a learner. A child who develops the habit of curiosity in a good classroom carries that habit forward. A child who develops the habit of helplessness in a bad classroom carries that forward too. So what does James advise, practically, about habit formation? He gives several principles that remain completely sound today. The first is to begin a new habit with as strong and decisive an initiative as possible. Do not drift into it. Do not try it casually and see how it goes. Commit to it fully from the start, because the nervous system responds to the intensity of the impression. A vivid, clear, committed beginning creates a stronger groove than a tentative, half-hearted one. The second principle is to never allow an exception until the new habit is securely rooted. This one is uncomfortable because exceptions feel harmless. One day off, one break, one moment of giving in. But James is insistent. Every exception is like a ball of string that you have been carefully winding and then drop. Every exception undoes a portion of the progress, not all of it, necessarily, but enough to slow the process significantly. Until a habit is genuinely established, every break is costly. The third principle, and this one is particularly interesting, is to seize every opportunity to act on every good resolution you make, to exercise every good habit at every chance you get. Because unused habits weaken. A habit is not a fixed thing you create once and then have forever. It is a living pattern that needs to be exercised. Every time you act on it, you reinforce it. Every time you fail to act when you could have, you let it weaken slightly. James then says something that many people find deeply motivating. He says that even if you feel no enthusiasm, even if you do not want to do the thing the habit calls for, do it anyway. Act the part. Go through the motion. Because the feelings, the enthusiasm, the genuine desire, often follow the action rather than preceding it. This is counterintuitive. We tend to wait until we feel motivated before we act. James says the sequence is frequently reversed. Act first. The feeling catches up. There is a story that is not in the book, but it illustrates this beautifully. A young man who wanted to be a writer kept waiting until he felt inspired to sit down and write. He would tell himself that he would write when the mood struck. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. Nothing got written. Then a mentor told him something simple. Sit down at the same time every morning and write, whether you feel like it or not. Write badly if you have to. Write sentences that go nowhere, but sit down and write. Within 3 months, the act of sitting down at that desk at that time had become so grooved into his nervous system that the resistance faded. He did not wait for inspiration. He showed up, and inspiration learned where to find him. That is what James means by habit. That is the flywheel in motion. Moving further into the book, James takes up the question of what the self is and how children experience it. He talks about the different layers of the self, the material self, which is your body and your possessions, the social self, which is how you are perceived and valued by others, and the spiritual self, which is your inner life, your sense of who you are at the deepest level. What makes this relevant to teaching is that children, like all of us, are fiercely protective of these different aspects of themselves. When you attack a child's work, they experience it as an attack on their social self. When you humiliate a child in front of others, you are touching something extremely tender and extremely important. When you give a child the experience of success, of being genuinely good at something, you are nourishing not just their academic performance but their sense of self-worth, their experience of themselves as capable, as valued, as someone who belongs in this space called learning. James is not saying teachers should never correct mistakes. Correction is essential, but there is a world of difference between correcting a mistake and diminishing a person. A skilled teacher learns to correct the work without making the child feel that their worth as a human being is on trial. This distinction, which sounds simple, is one of the most difficult things to actually practice day after day in a real classroom, especially when you are tired, when you have 30 other students to attend to, when the same mistake has been made for the 5th time. But it is the distinction that separates teaching that develops children from teaching that shrinks them. Around the 10-minute mark of thinking about all of this, it is worth pausing to say, if these ideas are resonating with you, if you are finding value in exploring the depth of what great thinkers have given us about learning and human potential, please consider liking this video and subscribing to Audiobook Library. It genuinely helps this channel grow and bring more of these ideas to more people. Every like and every subscription is a small act that makes a big difference. Thank you for that. Now, back to William James. James turns next to a concept that is deeply practical and that teachers often misunderstand. He talks about apperception, a word that sounds technical but captures something very human. Apperception is the process by which new information is received and understood through the lens of what you already know. Nothing comes into the mind in isolation. Every new fact, every new concept, every new idea enters through the doorway of existing knowledge and experience. If there is no existing knowledge that the new thing can connect to, it does not land. It passes through. It leaves no trace. This is why two students sitting in the same classroom, listening to the same lesson, can walk away with completely different understandings. The student who already has a rich context for the material, who has heard related things at home, who has read books that touch on similar ideas, who has had experiences that resonate with what is being taught, that student has many doorways through which the new information can enter and connect. The student who has none of that context has almost no doorways. The words go in, but they cannot attach to anything, so they slide back out. What does this mean for teaching? It means that one of the most important things you can do before introducing new material is to activate existing knowledge, to wake up what is already there, to remind students of things they already know that are related to what you are about to teach, to build the bridge from the familiar to the unfamiliar before you ask anyone to walk across it. This is not just a technique, it is how the mind actually works. James is describing the architecture of understanding, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. He also emphasizes the importance of variety in presentation. If you always explain things the same way, you are only building one doorway. But if you explain the same concept through a story, through a diagram, through a physical demonstration, through a connection to something from everyday life, through a question that the students try to answer before you give them the answer, you are building many doorways. You are increasing the chances that every student in the room will find at least one way in. This connects to something James says about the difference between memorizing and understanding. Memorizing is storing information in isolation. Understanding is connecting information into a web of relationships. When you understand something, you can approach it from multiple angles. You can explain it in different ways. You can use it to solve new problems you have never seen before. When you have only memorized it, you can reproduce it when prompted, but you cannot really use it. And when the prompt changes slightly, you are lost. James argues that the teacher's job is always to build understanding, not just memorization. And understanding comes from connection, from apperception, from the rich web of relationships between ideas. James also spends considerable time on what he calls the interest of the subject matter, and this is where he gets genuinely passionate. He believes, with everything in him, that interest is not a luxury in education. It is not something you earn after you have done the difficult, boring, important work. Interest is the engine of learning. Without it, even the most disciplined, most well-behaved student is only going through the motions. They are performing learning without actually doing it. And interest, James argues, comes in two forms. There is the kind that is immediate and obvious, the kind a child brings to a story about adventure or a puzzle that seems personally relevant or a question that connects to something they have already wondered about. And there is the kind that has to be developed, the kind where a child does not start out interested but becomes interested through exposure, through success, through the discovery that a subject has hidden depths that are genuinely surprising and rewarding. The second kind of interest is the one teachers have to work hardest to cultivate, and it requires a specific kind of faith, the faith that every subject, no matter how dry it might seem on the surface, contains genuine fascination if approached from the right angle. James had this faith. He believed that mathematics, properly taught, reveals the beauty of pure reason, that history, properly taught, reveals the drama of human choice and consequence, that biology, properly taught, reveals the astonishing complexity of life, that even grammar, properly taught, reveals the architecture of meaning. The subject is not boring. What is boring is a version of the subject that has been stripped of everything that makes it alive. A teacher who loves their subject is not just more enjoyable to listen to. They are fundamentally more effective, because love is contagious. Curiosity is contagious. Genuine enthusiasm for an idea, when it is authentic and not performed, does something to the people around it. It says, "Look at this thing. Look how remarkable it is. Come and see what I see." And students, even the most apparently resistant ones, respond to that invitation more than they respond to almost anything else. This brings James to something that might be one of the most important psychological insights in the entire book. He talks about what happens when interest and effort work together, when a student is genuinely engaged with something challenging. He calls this state one of the most valuable experiences that education can produce, because what it teaches is not just the content of the lesson. It teaches the student that effort is not the enemy of enjoyment. That working hard at something you care about is one of the most satisfying experiences a human being can have, that the struggle is part of the reward. This runs completely counter to the idea that education should be made as easy and painless as possible. James is not advocating for unnecessary difficulty. But he is insisting that difficulty, when connected to genuine interest, produces a kind of growth that easy comfort cannot. The student who wrestles with a hard problem and finally breaks through it has not just learned the answer. They have learned something about themselves. They have learned that they can do hard things. They have learned that their mind is capable of more than they thought. That experience is transformative in a way that simply being given the answer never could be. There is a story of a teacher, a real one, who taught in a struggling school in a low-income neighborhood. Her students came in believing they were not smart. They had been told in 100 subtle and not-so-subtle ways that school was not for them, that the life of the mind was not their inheritance. She decided to teach them philosophy, real philosophy. Plato, Socrates, the great questions. Her colleagues thought she was deluding herself. Her students were skeptical and defensive. But she was fascinated by philosophy, genuinely and deeply, and that fascination leaked into every class she taught. She would walk in with this barely contained excitement about whatever question they were going to wrestle with that day. And slowly, one by one, her students caught it. Not because she made philosophy easy, but because she made it feel like it was worth the effort. Within a year, those students were winning regional debate competitions, reading texts that university students found challenging, and most importantly, thinking of themselves as people who could engage with complex ideas. James would have recognized exactly what happened there. Genuine interest, meeting real challenge, producing transformation. James then writes about something he calls the reactions of the teacher, meaning the way teachers respond to students, and how those responses shape the student's inner life in ways that go far beyond the academic. He talks about the difference between a teacher who meets a struggling student with impatience, with sarcasm, with dismissal, and a teacher who meets that same student with patience, with genuine curiosity about where the confusion lies, with the assumption that the student can get there if given the right kind of support. The difference in outcome is not just about whether the student learns the material that day. It is about what the student learns about themselves as a learner, about whether effort is worth making, about whether asking for help is safe, about whether the classroom is a place where it is acceptable to not know something yet. These are not small things. They are the invisible curriculum that runs beneath every lesson, and they shape what kind of learner, what kind of thinker, what kind of person the child becomes. James has deep respect for what today would be called the emotional environment of the classroom. He does not use that language, but his understanding of the psychology is essentially modern. Children cannot learn well when they feel unsafe, not physically unsafe, though that matters enormously, but emotionally unsafe. When they fear ridicule, when they fear failure, when they feel that a wrong answer will cost them something important, their dignity, their teacher's approval, their social standing. Fear and learning are not good companions. Fear activates the part of the mind that is focused on survival, on self-protection, on getting through the threat safely. That part of the mind is not the part that is best at thinking, exploring, questioning, taking intellectual risks. A classroom where students feel safe to be wrong, safe to try, safe to ask questions that might seem stupid, is a classroom where real learning can happen. And that safety is created entirely by the teacher. It is not a policy or a curriculum. It is something in the way the teacher responds to the first student who gives a wrong answer, in the way the teacher responds to silence, in the way the teacher responds to a question that challenges their own authority. Students are watching all of that. They are reading the teacher constantly, and they calibrate their own level of risk-taking accordingly. From here, James moves into a territory that most education books of his era completely ignored. He talks about the will, about voluntary action, about the relationship between intention and behavior, and what he says is subtle and important. He argues that the will is not some separate faculty that you can strengthen like a muscle through pure repetition of effortful acts. The will, as he understands it, is closely bound up with motivation, with meaning, with the sense that what you are doing matters and connects to something you care about. You cannot simply tell a child to have more willpower and expect that instruction to produce willpower. You cannot simply expose children to difficulty and expect them to develop the capacity to push through difficulty. What you have to do is help them connect the difficult thing to something they genuinely want, something they care about, something they have chosen. When a child chooses to pursue something, when they feel a sense of ownership over their own learning, when they understand why the effort is worth making, then the will is engaged in a completely different way than when they are simply following instructions. This is one of the reasons James is so insistent that teaching cannot be reduced to technique, because motivating a child's will, connecting them to a genuine desire to learn and grow, requires understanding who that child is, what they care about, what their experience has been, what they find genuinely interesting. And that understanding can only be developed through relationship, through paying attention, through the kind of human attention that no system or method can replace. James then addresses the question of individual differences between students, and he is remarkably thoughtful about it for someone writing in the 1800s. He acknowledges that children are not the same. They have different temperaments, different rates of learning, different natural strengths and weaknesses, different histories. Some children are naturally quick and vivid in their responsiveness. Others are slower but deeper. Some respond readily to emotional appeals. Others respond better to logical structure. Some learn through movement and doing, others through listening and reading. None of these differences make a child more or less intelligent, more or less valuable, more or less worth teaching with full attention and care. But they do mean that a one-size-fits-all approach to teaching will always fail some children. Not because those children are failures, but because the approach has not been designed with them in mind. James is not calling for individualized instruction in the modern sense of differentiated learning plans and special education frameworks, though those things have grown from ideas like his. He is simply asking teachers to pay attention, to notice how different children respond, to be willing to try a different approach when the first one is not working, rather than concluding that the child is the problem. There is something quietly radical in this. In an era when children who did not conform to the standard educational approach were often labeled as deficient, as slow, as difficult, James is suggesting that the first question should not be what is wrong with this child, but rather what is wrong with this approach for this child. That shift in perspective, from diagnosing the student to examining the method, is one of the most important contributions James made to educational thinking. James also writes about what he calls the laws of motor habits, which is his way of talking about learning physical skills. The same principles that apply to intellectual habits apply to physical ones. The importance of practice, the importance of not allowing exceptions in the early stages, the importance of focusing attention during practice rather than going through the motions mindlessly. And he notes something that every athlete and musician and craftsperson intuitively knows. Physical skill, once truly learned, becomes unconscious. It moves below the level of conscious attention. And that freeing of consciousness is what allows the advanced practitioner to focus on the higher-level aspects of their art, the interpretation, the creativity, the judgment, rather than the mechanics. This is what learning to read is supposed to produce. A child who has truly mastered the mechanics of decoding text, who can recognize words automatically and fluently, has freed up their conscious attention to focus on meaning, on comprehension, on the ideas and stories the words are carrying. A child who is still struggling with decoding cannot focus on meaning because all their conscious energy is consumed by the mechanics. This is why the early years of literacy development are so important and why getting the foundations right matters so much for everything that follows. James has a beautiful way of describing this graduation from conscious effort to unconscious competence. He says that the final test of whether something has been truly learned is whether you can do it without thinking about it. And not in the sense of doing it carelessly, but in the sense of doing it effortlessly, of having the skill become so integrated into who you are that it no longer costs you anything to perform it. That is mastery. And the path to mastery runs through repetition, through practice, through the patient accumulation of experience that the nervous system gradually absorbs and makes automatic. For teachers, this has an important implication. Students need more practice than you might think, not because they are slow or incapable, but because that is how the human nervous system works. It needs repetition to build the grooves. And that practice has to be thoughtful, has to be varied enough to stay engaging, has to be distributed over time rather than crammed into a single intense session. The science of spacing, of returning to material over days and weeks rather than concentrating all practice in one sitting, is something James was already gesturing toward, decades before researchers formally demonstrated it. He also talks about the role of imitation in learning, and this is fascinating. Children learn an enormous amount through watching and copying. They imitate the people around them, their parents, their teachers, their peers. This is not a limitation or a shortcut. Imitation is one of the most powerful learning mechanisms the human mind possesses. It is how language is learned. It is how social behavior is learned. It is how many of the most fundamental skills of human life are transmitted from one generation to the next. For a teacher, this means you are always modeling, whether you intend to or not. Your students are watching how you respond to being wrong. They are watching how you engage with a difficult question. They are watching whether you express genuine curiosity or go through the motions. They are watching whether you treat all students with equal respect or whether your attention and warmth are unevenly distributed. They are learning from all of it, not just from the lessons you have planned. This is a heavy thing to sit with, but it is also, James suggests, a source of tremendous power, because it means that a teacher who genuinely embodies the intellectual virtues they are trying to develop in students who models curiosity, perseverance, intellectual honesty, openness to being wrong, delight in discovery, is doing something that no lesson plan can fully replicate. They are giving students a living example of what it looks like to love learning, and that example, absorbed through imitation, can shape a student's relationship with knowledge for the rest of their life. James closes many sections of his lectures with what you might call a reminder of the stakes. He comes back, again and again, to the idea that education is not preparation for life. It is life itself, happening in real time, in a real room, with real human beings whose inner lives are rich and complex and completely unique. Every day in a classroom is a day in the life of a child. Every interaction is real. Every moment of feeling seen or unseen, valued or ignored, capable or helpless, is real. These are not rehearsals. They count. And yet, James is never heavy-handed about this. He does not use guilt as a motivating tool. He does not paint teachers as either saviors or failures. He treats them with the same respect and thoughtfulness that he is asking them to extend to their students. He acknowledges that teaching is hard, that teachers are tired, that the same child who drove you to the edge of your patience today might be the one who breaks through tomorrow in a way that makes you remember exactly why you chose this work. He is honest about the difficulty, but he is also unfailingly warm about the importance of the people doing it. One of the most moving passages in the book comes near the end of the lectures, when James speaks directly to the emotional dimension of teaching. He talks about what it feels like to truly reach a student, to see understanding dawn in someone who was confused, to watch a child discover that they are capable of more than they thought, to be part of that moment of genuine growth. He calls it one of the deepest satisfactions available to a human being, and he means it. He is not being rhetorical. He genuinely believes that the work of a teacher, done well and done with full humanity, is as important as any work that exists. He also talks about what he calls the gospel of relaxation, which sounds odd coming from someone who has spent so much time talking about effort and habit and discipline. But what he means is that there is a particular kind of anxious tension that many teachers carry, a constant self-monitoring, a perfectionism, a fear of doing it wrong, that actually interferes with their effectiveness. The teacher who is relaxed, who trusts themselves in their relationship with their students, who is not performing but simply being present, is often more effective than the teacher who is technically more accomplished but gripped by anxiety. Relaxation, in James's sense, does not mean not caring. It means caring without the tension that constricts. It means bringing yourself fully to the work without being so worried about the outcome that you cannot actually enjoy the process. It means trusting that if you are genuine, if you are curious, if you care about the children in front of you and about the ideas you are trying to share, something worthwhile will happen. Maybe not everything you planned, maybe not in the way you expected, but something real. This is wisdom that teachers in every era have needed to hear. The profession can be relentlessly demanding. There is always more to do, always some gap between what you hoped for and what happened, always another challenge waiting tomorrow. Carrying all of that with anxious intensity is exhausting and ultimately counterproductive. James is essentially saying, breathe, trust the work, trust yourself, trust the student. Not naively, not by giving up on excellence, but by releasing the grip of perfectionism that makes the work heavier than it has to be. He also returns to a theme that runs through the entire book, which is that the best thing a teacher can do for a student is to help them become more themselves, not less. Education that produces conformity, that irons out individuality in the name of efficiency or order, has missed the point entirely. Each child is a unique configuration of capacities, interests, temperaments, and potentials. The teacher's job is not to fit all of them into the same mold. It is to help each of them discover and develop what is already there. This does not mean abandoning standards or pretending that all performances are equally good. James is not relativistic in that way. He believes in excellence. He believes in rigor. He believes that some things are better understood than others, some work is better than other work, some habits of mind are more valuable than others. But he holds all of that alongside a genuine respect for the individuality of each student, and he believes that the two are not in conflict. You can have high standards and still see each child as an individual. You can pursue excellence and still make room for difference. In fact, the best teaching does exactly that. As James nears the conclusion of his lectures, he says something that lands differently depending on who you are and where you are in your relationship to teaching. He says that the purpose of education, ultimately, is to produce a person who is capable of learning from life itself, not just from books and classrooms, but from experience, from observation, from relationships, from failure, from success, from every encounter with the world. A person who has been genuinely educated is not someone who has memorized a certain quantity of information. They are someone whose mind has been opened, whose curiosity has been lit, whose capacity for growth is alive and functioning and self-directed. That is the destination. The classroom is not the destination, it is the training ground. The real test of whether education has worked comes not in the examination room but in the years that follow, when no teacher is present, when there is no grade to earn, when the only motivation for learning and growing is the one that lives inside the person themselves. Did the education plant that? Did it develop an inner drive toward understanding and engagement with the world? Or did it produce dependency on external authority, passive reception of information, the ability to perform well when someone else is managing the process, and helplessness when the structure is removed? James does not answer that question for any specific student or school. He poses it. He leaves it with the teacher as a kind of North Star, not a judgment but a direction. And then, in his final words to these teachers gathered in Cambridge all those years ago, he says something that has stayed with readers ever since. He tells them that the work they are doing matters in ways they will never fully see. That the effect of a good teacher ripple outward through time, through the students they teach, through the choices those students make, through the lives those students build, through the people those students eventually teach in turn. The influence of a truly good teacher does not end when the school year ends. It does not end when the child grows up. It does not even end when the teacher dies. It continues in ways invisible and unmeasurable in the people who carry forward something that was given to them. There is a kind of faith in that, a faith that the work matters even when you cannot see the results. A faith that the care you bring to a single interaction with a single child on a single afternoon might be the thing that nudges their life in a direction they could never have found alone. James holds that faith seriously. He does not offer it as a consolation prize for the difficulties of the job. He offers it as a true statement about the nature of human influence and the particular, remarkable, irreplaceable power of a good teacher. What William James gave to teachers was not a system. It was a way of seeing. He gave them a psychological framework for understanding the mind of the child, and through that, a deeper and more compassionate way of understanding their own role. He told them that they were not technicians executing a process. They were human beings in relationship with other human beings, doing work that was equal parts science and art, equal parts knowledge and wisdom, equal parts discipline and love. The book is over 100 years old, and almost nothing in it feels dated. That is the mark of a genuinely great thinker writing about genuinely enduring things. The human mind has not fundamentally changed since William James was alive. Children still learn through connection. They still need genuine interest to sustain effort. They still form habits that persist. They still need to feel safe before they can take risks. They still respond to genuine enthusiasm. They still need teachers who see them as individuals. They still need the experience of genuine challenge met with genuine support. All of that is as true today as it was in Cambridge in 1892. If you are a teacher, or if you know a teacher, or if you were ever shaped by a teacher who truly saw you, this book is worth your time. Not just as a historical document, as a living guide to the most human work there is. And if you have made it this far, through all of this, thank you, truly. This took a long time to put together, and it was put together because these ideas deserve to be heard, to be thought about, to circulate in the world among people who care about learning and about the human beings doing it. Please like this video if it gave you something. Please subscribe to Audiobook Library so that we can keep bringing you more of these deep, rich, lasting ideas from the books that have genuinely shaped how we understand ourselves and each other. Every subscription is a vote for this kind of content to keep existing, and it costs you nothing except a moment of your time. Before you go, please do take a look at the other videos on this channel. There is a growing library here of summaries and explorations of books that matter, books about the mind, about human nature, about how we learn and how we live, and how we become more of who we are capable of being. Each one is made with the same care and attention as this one. There is almost certainly something in that library that will speak to wherever you are right now in your thinking and your life. William James believed that ideas change lives. He believed that a person who truly understands something about human nature, about how attention works, about how habits form, about how interest drives learning, is a more effective and more humane version of themselves. Not just a better teacher, but a better human being. And he believed that those better human beings multiplied across classrooms and schools and communities and generations are how the world slowly, imperfectly, beautifully gets better. That is why he wrote these lectures. That is why they still matter. That is why you just spent this time with them. And that time was not wasted. Carry these ideas forward. Let them change how you see the next child who struggles in front of you, the next student who seems distracted, the next person who tells you they are not smart enough for something. You now know something James knew, that the mind is plastic, that habit is powerful, that interest is the engine, that connection is the foundation, and that the work of helping another human being grow is among the most important things one person can do for another. Thank you for listening.